On the Wyoming frontier in 1891, you prepared for winter with thick timber, fieldstone, and pride. But one man, Silas Sutton, Clear's throat, did the unthinkable. He went down to the swamps and gambled the lives of his wife and daughter on weeds. Laughter spread through the valley faster than a winter wind. His neighbors called him a fool. Passers-by pointed at the bizarre structure rising around his cabin, giving it a mocking name, the Pharaoh Shack. A crude shell of reeds, something a cow wouldn't even eat. How could that possibly stand up to a Wyoming winter? But they didn't know the coming winter was no ordinary music winter. It had a name of its own, the Black Wind Winter. A force of nature so vicious it could kill a horse standing in an open field and freeze the very hope in a man's heart. If you believe stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity deserve to be told, support us with a like and hit subscribe to follow Silas Sutton's journey as he proves an entire valley wrong. Silas Sutton was not an educated man. Nobody in the Wyoming foothills would have mistaken him for an architect or an engineer. He read slowly, wrote even slower. Most of his knowledge lived in his hands instead of books. But 20 years earlier, long before he ever built a cabin beneath those cold western hills, Silas had spent nearly a year working freight boats and hauling supplies for a British-American excavation crew near Luxor along the Nile River. He did not understand hieroglyphs. He could not remember the names of the dead kings buried beneath the sand. What he remembered were the structures: mud grain houses standing cool beneath brutal desert heat, thick double walls packed with woven reeds, narrow breathing gaps hidden inside clay, rooms that somehow held still air while the world outside burned. The memory never left him. One evening, while unloading crates beside the riverbank, Silas overheard a Scottish engineer studying one of the old storage buildings. The man tapped the wall with his knuckles and said quietly, "The Egyptians understood trapped air long before modern builders understood heat." At the time, Silas barely understood what the sentence meant, but he remembered the feeling. Outside, the desert heat could kill a mule by noon. Inside those ancient reed-lined walls, the air felt calm, still, alive somehow. And 20 years later, standing in the Wyoming wind, that old memory returned to him with absolute clarity. The Sutton cabin had been built the same way most line shacks were built across the Wyoming foothills. Cottonwood logs, fieldstone foundation, mud-packed seams, heavy walls, a respectable structure by frontier standards. And during the first winter, it failed them almost immediately. The wind found every weakness. It slipped through shrinking joints in the cottonwood logs and rolled across the floor in waves cold enough to numb bare feet within seconds. The stone foundation held the night frost long after sunrise. Some mornings, a thin layer of ice formed directly across the floorboards beside the bed. The stove never truly rested. Silas fed it before dawn, again at midday, again before sleep. Still, the cabin rarely climbed above 43 degrees. The cold settled into everything. His wife, Miriam Sutton, kept soup bowls close beside the stove because grease would harden across the surface if they sat too far from the heat. Their 8-year-old daughter, Ruth, began sleeping with a wool scarf tied across her mouth because breathing the air at night made her lungs ache sharply enough to wake her crying. The walls themselves sweated frost. By February, Silas had burned nearly 8 full cords of firewood, and somehow the cabin still felt hungry for heat. Then came the night Ruth coughed so violently she spotted a faint streak of blood onto the wool cloth covering her mouth. That was the moment Silas stopped believing the cabin could survive another winter unchanged. Late one February morning, Silas Sutton stood outside the cabin watching loose snow race across the frozen ground. The drifts did not fall gently that day. The Wyoming wind sliced through them sideways, tearing long white streaks across the foothills like sand across stone, and suddenly he understood something that had been hiding in front of him all winter. The problem was not the stove. The problem was movement. Cabin could make heat. It simply could not hold still air long enough to keep that heat alive. Every crack in the walls, every cold seam in the timber, every shifting board allowed the wind to steal warmth faster than the fire could replace it. That memory from Egypt returned hard and clear. The grain houses near Luxor had not stayed cool because their walls were massive. They stayed cool because the walls trapped quiet pockets of air inside layered chambers of mud and reeds. Still air. That was the secret. Heat made is useless if wind keeps stealing it faster than walls can hold it. Silas walked back inside without speaking. He pulled a scrap plank beside the stove and began sketching with a piece of charcoal. Double walls, suspended reed chambers, breathing cavities between layers. Outside, the wind hammered the cabin again. Inside, for the first time all winter, Silas Sutton believed he could finally see the enemy clearly. For nearly a week, Silas Sutton said very little about the sketches beside the stove. He studied the cabin instead. He measured distances with a strip of cord, pressed his palm against the cold inner walls before sunrise, watched how frost gathered heavier along the north side where the wind struck hardest. By the end of February, the plan had become simple in his mind. He would not rebuild the cabin. He would wrap it. The new outer frame would stand 18 inches away from the original walls. Between the two layers, Silas planned to suspend tightly woven reed chambers designed to trap quiet air instead of allowing wind to move freely through the structure. Rough pine siding would shield the outer layer from snow and rain, while narrow breathing gaps allowed moisture to escape. Not a sealed wall, a living one. One night, Miriam sat beside the stove studying the charcoal drawings, while Ruth slept beneath two blankets nearby. The fire cracked softly between them. Finally, she looked up at her husband and asked, "You really think swamp reeds can stop a Wyoming winter?" Silas kept carving at a wood peg for several seconds before answering, "No." Then he raised his eyes toward the frost gathering along the window frame. "But trapped air might." Miriam said nothing after that. Outside, the foothill wind scraped across the cabin walls again like a warning. Inside, she quietly accepted that her husband was preparing to gamble their reputation against the winter itself. By early spring, the Sutton family began harvesting cattail reeds from the low marsh country beneath the foothills. It was slow work, wet work. Silas and Miriam stood shin-deep in black water for hours at a time, cutting tall reeds near the base with short-handled knives while cold mud pulled at their boots. Wagon after wagon returned to the cabin loaded with bundles stacked higher than the wheels. To most people, it would have looked like useless swamp grass. To Silas, every stalk mattered. Reeds cut too green would trap moisture and rot inside the walls. Reeds dried too long beneath direct sun became brittle and lost the dense spring structure needed to hold air properly. The material had to cure slowly, not wet, not dead dry, just right. Silas judged the reeds the same way an old carpenter judged timber, by touch, by sound. He lifted bundles beside his ear and listened to the soft papery rustle when the stalks shifted together. He bent individual reeds slowly, testing how much resistance remained inside the fibers before cracking. Sometimes he split one open with his thumbnail and smelled the faint damp scent still trapped in the center. Miriam helped arrange the bundles beneath a long canvas shelter where wind could pass through without direct rain. Nearby, Ruth sat cross-legged tying finished bundles together with hemp cord. The work lasted for weeks. One evening, after watching her father stack another row of drying reeds against the fence line, Ruth looked toward the cabin and quietly asked, "Will this make the wall stop shaking at night?" Silas looked at the old cottonwood cabin for a long moment before answering, "That's the idea." By midsummer, the outer frame had begun to surround the Sutton cabin completely. Long, rough-cut posts rose around the original structure like the skeleton of a second building. Crossbeams stretched overhead. Thick woven reed chambers hung between the framing sections waiting for siding to cover them later. From a distance, the cabin no longer looked like a home. It looked trapped inside something larger, buried almost. Riders passing through the foothills started slowing their horses to stare. Some circled wide just to get a better look before continuing down the trail. The comments began quietly at first. Then Boyd Ricker saw the structure while hauling freight into town and burst out laughing hard enough to stop his wagon team. "Pharaoh's building himself a tomb." The men around him howled. By the end of the week, the trading post had a new joke. People called the place the Pharaoh Shack. Silas never answered the insults. He kept hammering reed chambers into place while the wind pushed dust through the valley around him. But one afternoon, Ruth heard a pair of riders laughing outside the fence line, and for the first time, she realized the whole valley had started laughing at her father. What Silas Sutton built around that cabin was not simply insulation. It was a system. The woven cattail sections were arranged in layered chambers instead of one solid packed mass. Thick reed cylinders sat between narrow air gaps inside the outer wall frame. Some sections were tightly woven to slow air flow. Others were intentionally looser, allowing small amounts of trapped air to remain still without sealing moisture inside the structure. That difference mattered. A completely sealed wall could trap condensation the same way a shut cellar traps rot. Too much airflow, however, would let the Wyoming wind strip heat away faster than the stove could replace it. Silas was trying to balance both forces at once, warmth and breath. The outer siding itself never touched the reed chambers directly. A narrow cavity remained between them, so any moisture driven through the pine boards could dry naturally before reaching the inner layers. The mud-lime sealing mixture around the chambers added another layer of protection. Unlike pure clay, the lime helped resist moisture buildup while still allowing the wall to release damp air slowly over time. No builder in that valley constructed houses this way. Most frontier cabins relied on thickness alone. Heavy logs, thick stone, more mass, more fuel. Silas was building something different, not a heavier wall, a quieter one. One evening, while adjusting the reed density along the north side, Miriam asked if packing the chambers tighter would make the cabin warmer. Silas shook his head. "A dead wall rots," he said calmly. "A breathing wall survives." And beneath the Wyoming sun, surrounded by woven reeds and rough timber frames, an ancient idea from the Nile River was beginning to take shape again on the American frontier. The first real problem appeared during an early October snowstorm. Wet snow mixed with freezing rain hammered the north side of the cabin for nearly 14 straight hours. By midnight, the outer siding along one section had turned dark with moisture. Silas woke before dawn uneasy for reasons he could not fully explain. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside carrying a lantern through the wind. The cold hit hard enough to burn his lungs immediately. Snow hissed across the ground around his boots. Working by lantern light, he pried loose several outer boards from the north wall and reached into the cavity behind the reeds. His expression changed instantly. A thin layer of condensation had formed inside the chamber. Not water ice. Small, fragile, but real. The wall was holding too much trapped moisture along the coldest section of the cabin. The next morning, Warren Pike, the local sawmill owner and the most respected builder in the foothills, stopped by after hearing about the repairs. He studied the open section silently before shaking his head. "I told you," he said, "your walls are starting to die already." Silas did not argue. That night, while frost gathered across his beard in tiny white crystals, he redesigned the north wall in silence. He cut additional ventilation slots beneath the eaves and reduced the reed packing density near the coldest airflow channels. The mistake had been real, and now the wall had to learn how to breathe better before winter arrived for good. A few days after the storm, Warren Pike returned to the Sutton cabin for what he privately considered a final inspection. The older builder walked slowly around the structure, studying every detail with a hard professional eye. He pressed his thumb against the mud-lime seams, looked up at the new ventilation slots beneath the eaves, knocked against the reed-packed walls with his knuckles. Then he turned towards Silas. "You still don't understand the danger here," he said evenly. "Rodents will find gaps eventually. Moisture always finds a place to settle, and if one spark reaches those dry reeds," he glanced toward the stovepipe, "this whole cabin becomes a torch box." There was no mockery in his voice, only conviction. Miriam Clear's throat stood near the doorway, listening quietly while cold wind moved across the yard between them. For several seconds, Silas said nothing at all. Then he looked toward the gray Wyoming sky gathering above the foothills. "Then winter will tell us," he said calmly, "which one of us understands these walls." And beneath the silence that Silas finally understood the full weight of what he had built. If he was wrong, the cost would not be embarrassment. It would be his family. By November, the Sutton cabin had become entertainment. Men at the trading post talked about it the way people talk about a barn collapse or a drunk preacher. Every new wagon coming through the foothills eventually heard the same joke, the Pharaoh Shack. One bitter evening, Boyd Ricker leaned back beside the stove with a cup of coffee in one hand and announced loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "Man wrapped his house like a dead king in a pyramid." The room exploded with laughter. Someone else added, "Probably figures Egypt's warmer than Wyoming." Even the storekeeper grinned. Silas stood near the flour barrels listening in silence while snow hissed against the windows outside. Later that night, his cousin Amos Sutton followed him out into the cold behind the trading post. Amos grabbed his coat sleeve before he could reach the wagon. "You need to stop this foolishness," he snapped. "People think you're either too poor to buy proper lumber or too stupid to understand winter out here. Either way, the Sutton name looks bad because of it." The pressure did not end there. 2 days later, a winter hauling contract Silas depended on was quietly handed to another freighter. Nobody explained why directly. They did not need to. In the foothills, a man survived partly on reputation, and Silas Sutton could feel his collapsing around him one laugh at a time. The clear's throat, final voice against the Sutton cabin, arrived carrying government papers. Elias Mercer, the territorial agricultural inspector, rode into the foothills during the first week of December with a leather case full of official bulletins and weather reports. He was a narrow man with careful hair, clean gloves, and the kind of confidence that comes from printed diagrams. Mercer inspected the cabin slowly. He studied the reed walls, the ventilation gaps beneath the eaves, the mudlime seams packed between the chambers. Then he opened one of his pamphlets. "The department recommends sawdust insulation between sealed walls," he explained. "Tar paper, storm shutters, controlled sealing methods." He tapped the reed structure lightly with 2 fingers. "This kind of foreign superstition creates instability." He particularly disliked the ventilation design. "A good wall should seal completely," he said firmly. "Air movement is loss." Silas listened without interrupting once. No argument, no defense, only silence. After Mercer finally rode away through the drifting snow, Miriam remained standing near the window watching the inspector disappear into the valley. Then she turned quietly toward her husband. "What if he's right?" For several moments, Silas said nothing. Outside, wind carried thin sheets of snow powder low across the frozen ground like smoke. At last, he looked toward the moving white trails crossing the valley floor. "A sealed wall traps death same as heat," he said softly. And for the first time since the work began, Miriam felt genuine fear that her husband might be gambling their lives on an old memory carried home from a desert half a world away. Then December arrived, and with it came the black wind winter. The first storm rolled down from the northern plains just after dusk. By midnight, the foothills had vanished behind moving walls of snow. Wind gusts screamed through the valley at more than 50 miles an hour, rattling windows hard enough to shake dishes from shelves. By morning, the temperature had fallen to 41 below zero, not wind chill, actual air temperature. The cold changed the shape of daily life almost immediately. Snow drifting against the cabins hardened into dense crusts sharp enough to cut leather gloves. Water buckets froze solid indoors before sunrise if left too far from the stove. Livestock caught in open pasture sometimes died standing upright where the wind found them, and the sound never stopped, that endless howling. For 19 straight days, the temperature never climbed above 2 degrees. The black wind winter did not behave like ordinary cold. It behaved like pressure, constant, physical, deliberate. It pulled warmth from walls the way river current strips soil from a riverbank. Doors froze into their frames. Window glass developed white frost so thick it blocked sunlight completely. Men hauling firewood wrapped scarves across their faces and still coughed blood into the snow before returning home. The prairie no longer cared how expensive a cabin had been to build, or who built it, or what people laughed at back in autumn. That winter reduced every house in the foothills to a single question: could it hold still air long enough to keep human beings alive? And while the valley fought to survive the cold, Silas Sutton waited quietly inside the Pharaoh Shack for the only judgment that mattered now, the judgment of the wind itself. By the second week of January, Cabins across the valley had begun to fail one after another. Not all at once, slowly first, then all together. Chimneys clogged with creosote from stoves burning day and night without rest. Smoke backed into rooms faster than it could escape, filling cabins with thick air that burned eyes and lungs raw. Frost formed inside blankets where human breath froze during sleep. Families woke to find ice gathered along the edges of mattresses and animal hides stiff with cold beside the walls. The firewood disappeared fastest. People started burning anything dry enough to catch flame. Broken chairs, fence rails, tool handles. One man in the lower valley stood outside his cabin at dawn chopping apart his own child's wooden cradle because the wood pile had already run out 2 days earlier. A neighbor later admitted the man cried while swinging the axe. The cold stripped pride away from people piece by piece. Jonas Reed, a rancher living west of the creek line, finally butchered his last mule because he no longer had enough feed to keep the animal alive through the month. Another family abandoned their cabin entirely and moved into a livestock barn where animal heat kept the air barely survivable. Even Warren Pike was losing ground. The respected builder burned nearly 2 cords of seasoned pine in a single month trying to keep his workshop above 40 degrees. Still, frost gathered across the inside walls before dawn. The old methods were not holding. Heavy timber, stone foundations, bigger stoves, more firewood. The black wind winter was grinding through all of it like a saw through rotten wood. And somewhere beneath the 40 Elias, hidden behind walls packed with woven reeds, Silas Sutton's strange Egyptian cabin waited silently while the rest of the valley slowly froze around it. The first strange reports about the Sutton cabin began during the worst stretch of the January storms. Doc Harlan Reese, the valley physician, was riding through near whiteout conditions after visiting a ranch family east of the creek. Snow blew so hard across the trail that his horse lowered its head almost to the ground just to keep moving. As Reese passed the Sutton property, something caught his attention immediately: the chimney smoke, or rather the lack of it. Most cabins in the valley pushed thick black smoke into the air by then. Fires had to be fed constantly just to hold back the cold. But the Sutton cabin released only a thin gray ribbon drifting lazily into the wind. The doctor slowed his horse. Then he noticed something else. Snow across the roof had melted unevenly in narrow strips instead of forming thick ice buildup along the edges. Even stranger, the windows showed almost no frost accumulation around the frames. Reese stared at the cabin for several seconds before finally riding on through the storm. The next morning, Boyd Ricker passed the property hauling freight south toward town. He looked toward the cabin out of habit, expecting the same ugly reed-covered box everyone joked about for months. Instead, he saw Ruth Sutton standing near the window wearing nothing but a wool dress and stockings. She was not shivering. Boyd slowly pulled his wagon team to a stop. Then he looked down at the thermometer hanging beside the freight seat. 37 below. For the first time all winter, Boyd Ricker said absolutely nothing. And across the valley, the laughter surrounding the Pharaoh Shack began to disappear beneath something far more dangerous: confusion. Warren Pike arrived at the Sutton place just before dusk with a sled stacked high with seasoned pine. He had convinced himself the visit was necessary. By then, he fully expected the reed walls to be wet inside, rotting perhaps, maybe frozen solid. He imagined Silas and his family crowded beside an overf stove trying not to freeze inside that strange Egyptian coffin of a cabin. Snow blew hard across the yard as Warren climbed the porch steps and knocked once against the door. The door opened. Warmth rolled out steadily into the night air. Not blazing heat, not desperate heat, gentle warmth. The kind that belonged to another season entirely. Warren stood motionless. Then, without even realizing it, he slowly pulled off one glove because his body could not quite believe what it was feeling. For several seconds, Warren Pike could only stare through the doorway. No frantic stove feeding, no smoke choking the room, no desperate piling of blankets against doors and windows. Inside the cabin, Miriam Sutton stood near the table shaping cornbread dough with her sleeves rolled calmly above her elbows. Ruth slept in a wooden chair beside the frost-covered window without the wool scarf that had covered her face all winter the year before. The stove itself burned low and quiet, not roaring, not fighting for survival, simply working. Silas stepped aside and handed Warren a steaming tin cup of coffee without saying a word. Warren accepted it slowly, still unable to process the air around him. Then clear as throat his eyes found the thermometer hanging near the center beam. 68 degrees outside, the black wind winter still screamed across the foothills at 41 degrees below zero, 109 degrees of difference. Warren looked back toward the walls, toward the strange reed chambers he had condemned for months. Then he crossed the room almost unconsciously and pressed his bare palm against the interior wall beside the window. His expression changed immediately. The wall was not cold. It was not even cool. It felt neutral, calm, like the inside wall of a summer house untouched by winter. Behind him, the wind slammed against the cabin hard enough to shake snow from the roof. Inside, the Pharaoh Shack did not even tremble. Silas Sutton did not celebrate. He did not smile proudly or speak like a man proving someone wrong. Instead, he walked quietly to a shelf beside the stove and returned holding a worn ledger with softened corners and soot stains along the edges. He handed it to Warren Pike without ceremony. Inside were pages of careful records. Daily outdoor temperatures, indoor temperatures measured morning and night, firewood consumption, ventilation changes after the October moisture problem, airflow notes near the north wall, even humidity observations written beside weather conditions. Warren sat at the table turning the pages slowly while the steady stove crackled nearby. The numbers became impossible to ignore. Compared to cabins of similar size across the foothills, the Sutton place was burning nearly 70% less firewood while maintaining higher indoor temperatures than any structure Warren had ever seen during a Wyoming winter. Not slightly better, categorically different. Warren stood again and began inspecting the cabin like a man studying a machine that should not function. He checked the wall temperature beside the windows, measured airflow near the ventilation gaps with damp fingertips, studied the dryness of the reed chambers near the outer seams. Everything remained stable, balanced, breathing exactly the way Silas claimed it would. Outside, the black wind winter continued hammering the valley without mercy. Inside, the cabin held still air like a sealed pocket of another climate. At last, Warren removed his gloves completely and stared silently at the reed-lined wall beside the stove. Then he spoke in a low voice stripped of pride. "We built heavy walls for 50 years. He paused and never understood air. Word of Warren Pike's visit spread through the foothills faster than the storms themselves. And 2 weeks later, Elias Mercer returned to the Sutton cabin carrying far more than government pamphlets. This time he arrived with instruments, calibrated thermometers packed in wool cloth, humidity gauges wrapped inside leather cases, measuring notebooks already marked with reference tables and weather charts. Mercer approached the cabin with the stiff caution of a man preparing either to expose fraud or witness something deeply inconvenient. Silas allowed him inside without comment. For nearly 4 hours, Mercer worked methodically through the structure. He measured wall surface temperatures beside the windows and near the floor. He checked airflow movements around the ventilation slots beneath the eaves. He opened sections of the outer siding and inspected the reed chambers directly for moisture retention. He expected to find damage somewhere. Rot hidden beneath the reeds, condensation trapped inside the cavities, mold beginning to spread behind the mudlime seams. But none of it was there. The chambers remained dry. The airflow remained balanced. The wall temperatures remained shockingly stable despite the brutal cold outside. Again and again, Mercer repeated the same measurements as if the numbers themselves offended him personally. Yet every instrument confirmed the same impossible conclusion. The Sutton cabin was not surviving the black wind winter through excess heat. It was surviving because the structure controlled moving air better than any cabin Mercer had ever inspected in frontier territory. Science was not disproving the reed walls. It was slowly catching up to them. At last, Mercer closed his notebook very carefully and looked around the quiet cabin once more. The stove burned low. Ruth slept peacefully near the window. The walls breathed softly around them, and for several long seconds, Mercer stood completely silent, like a man who had just encountered something that should not have worked, but undeniably did. The first man to ask for help was Jonas Reed. By late February, his remaining firewood supply had fallen so low that he could no longer afford pride. He rode to the Sutton place one gray morning with cracked hands, smoke-stained clothes, and exhaustion written across his face. He removed his hat before speaking. "Can you show me how to build part of it?" he asked quietly. Silas did. Together, the two men built a simplified reed wall patch along the north side of the reed cabin using woven cattail chambers and a narrow breathing cavity beneath rough pine boards. It was smaller than the Sutton system, less refined, but within days, the indoor temperature inside Jonas Reed's cabin rose nearly 14 degrees, while his wood usage dropped close to half. That was enough. By spring, the marshlands beneath the foothills were crowded with families cutting cattails instead of mocking them. Wagons once loaded with jokes now carried bundles of drying reeds across the valley floor. The laughter disappeared almost completely. Even Warren Pike changed. The old builder began offering modified reed envelope systems in new cabin construction throughout the territory. At first, customers called them Egypt walls. Later, Pike started listing the design under a different name, the Sutton envelope wall, and people paid extra for it. The strangest moment came one windy afternoon outside the trading post. Boyd Ricker stood beside Silas watching several men unload reed bundles from a wagon near the creek road. For a long time, Boyd said nothing at all. Then, almost reluctantly, he glanced toward the woven chambers stacked beside the Sutton wagon and asked, "How tight do you weave the reeds?" Silas looked at him for a moment. Then he answered calmly, as if the valley had never laughed in the first place. Years later, long after the Black Wind winter had passed into frontier memory, a newspaper reporter traveled into the Wyoming foothills to interview Silas Sutton about the cabin. People now called one of the most unusual engineering successes in territorial history. The reporter expected diagrams, grand theories perhaps. Instead, he found an older man repairing fence posts beside the same reed-wrapped cabin with rough, scarred hands darkened by decades of work. The walls still stood. A section of the original reed chamber had been opened near the back corner years earlier for inspection. The cattails inside remained dry, tight, intact. Time had darkened them slightly, but the structure itself had survived winter after winter without collapsing into rot. The reporter walked slowly around the cabin taking notes while cold mountain wind rolled down from the foothills. Finally, he looked toward Silas and said, "Some people are calling this revolutionary frontier engineering." Silas rested both hands on the fence rail for a moment before shaking his head. "No," he said quietly, "just old ideas that survived longer than pride did." That was the truth the Black Wind winter had revealed to the valley. The storm never cared who people mocked at the trading post. It did not care whose cabin looked respectable or whose methods appeared foolish. The wind judged everything the same way by results, and when the cold finally tested every wall across those foothills, the strange Egyptian cabin wrapped in woven reeds outlived the laughter surrounding it. Because the frontier never truly rewarded pride, it rewarded what worked. Outside, Wyoming wind still moved across the grasslands exactly as it had before the Sutton cabin was ever built. And somewhere inside those old breathing walls, quiet air still held warmth against the cold. The wind never apologized. It simply stopped arguing once the walls proved stronger than winter itself. What do you think? Would you have laughed at Silas Sutton for wrapping his cabin in reeds? Or would you have trusted a 3,000-year-old Egyptian idea before the winter proved him right?